I know that most of you know Yuki, but there isn't enough to praise Yuki's work. So let me just, give you a little bit of a reminder of who Yuki Kihara is. An interdisciplinary artist whose work seeks to challenge dominant and singular historical narratives through visual arts, dance and curatorial practice, engaging with post-colonial history and representation in the Pacific, and how they intersect with race, gender, spirituality, and sexual politics. Yuki's works have been presented and exhibited around the world and regionally and nationally. And Yuki is currently the a research fellow at the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, a position she has been having since 2016. And the great news is that Yuki will be representing Aotearoa, New Zealand at the upcoming 59th Venice Biennale in 2022. And knowing how busy Yuki is, we are very, very grateful and honored to have her here today. So Yuki, please share with us.
Morena, talo falava, fatalo fatilipa ia, mana maruli au fio. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our creator that has enabled us to come together this morning for this wonderful symposium. And I would also like to acknowledge the people of Ngati Whatua, whose lands in Tamaki Makaurau I currently occupy and streaming my presentation to you today. Also, thanks to the Center for Global Migration and the Small Islands Cultures Research Initiative for the kind invitation to present my recent body of work entitled Quarantine Islands. So I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation. So I will now begin my talk. Okay, so my presentation today will briefly outline the inspiration and research behind the development of Quarantine Island series, including how the Pacific was implicated in the development of quarantine facilities across Aotearoa, New Zealand. I will now play a short video about Quarantine Islands as a prelude to my PowerPoint presentation today. Directly following the Aotearoa, New Zealand lockdown, I produced a lenticular photographic series entitled Quarantine Islands between March and April of 2021. The production involved traveling with my production crew across New Zealand to stage photo shoots in islands located near the main ports, formerly used to keep people and animals with contagious diseases in quarantine. These islands, often thought of as being peripheral, distant, isolated, remote, and undeveloped, were highly sought after by the New Zealand government as a strategic location in maintaining and sustaining mainland interests. While these islands no longer function as quarantine centers, the fears surrounding the history of these islands, with some surprising links to Samoa, continues to linger into the present. The photo shoot featured myself working in multiple roles as a writer, producer, director, and actor, dressed in a guise of Salome, a fictitious character based on a Samoan woman dressed in a Victorian morning dress, resurrected from the past to see what has taken place in the present. Salome's visit to these quarantine islands aims to uncover the history and the hidden costs behind the management of deadly viruses, and considers what wisdom these islands may offer in the post-COVID-19 era. The Quarantine Islands is a photographic series featuring lenticular printing technology, which provides 3D images, illusion of giving an illusion of depth, together with the ability to change or move as the image is viewed from different angles. In the context of Quarantine Islands, the lenticular photography allows for an immersive experience, further emphasized by the surreal, anachronistic presence of Salome in a contemporary landscape. The Quarantine Island series features myself performing a fictitious persona named Salome, a Samoan woman resurrected from the 19th century, inspired by a photograph entitled Samoan Half-Caste, taken by New Zealand colonial photographer Thomas Andrew. Quarantine Island series is a personal, artistic, and critical response to the current global 19 pandemic that reframes the dominant histories and uncovers the history and hidden cost behind the management of deadly viruses, and considers what wisdom the stories of these islands may offer in the post-COVID-19 era. In addition, the Quarantine Island series explores how the colonial perception of an island being peripheral, distant, isolated, remote, and undeveloped, as alluded in our Sea of Islands essay by Fijian Tongan writer Ipeli Hauofa, as a highly sought after, as a strategic location in maintaining and sustaining mainland interests. There are two historical events regarding the management of pandemics by the New Zealand colonial administration in Samoa that informed the Quarantine Islands series. The first historical event alludes to a photograph entitled Mass Grave Vaimoso, which depicts Salome visiting the site where Samoa buried close to 1/5 of its population, approximately 8,500 people who died from the 1918 influenza pandemic brought there by Talune, a trader ship that left Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. This is also the first time New Zealand colonial administration deliberately used influenza pandemic as a bioweapon in the colonies. And in the case of Samoa, it was used to weaken the Mau independence movement. The second historical event is the leprosy control during the German and New Zealand colonial administration of Samoa, where Nu'utele Islet was designated as a leprosy station between 1914 to 1922, and the relocation of leprosy sufferers in 1922 to the Fiji leprosy colony on the island of Makongai. These historical events got me thinking about how New Zealand colonial administration was managing pandemics, including quarantine, in their own country, and how it informed the management of pandemics in the colonies during the early 20th century. The origin of quarantine comes from the Italian for 40 days, 40 gironi, which referred to the number of days ships arriving in Venice from infected cities were required to be at anchor before they could unload their goods. This began in the 14th century in efforts to protect Venice from plague epidemics. Venetians also quarantined their citizens and visitors alike upon a number of plague islands in the lagoon, such as Lazaretto Vecchio, later the island of Poveglia, excuse my pronunciation. The islands in Aotearoa, explored in Quarantine Island series, connect to the quarantine colonies intended to prevent the spread of similar infectious diseases in Venice. The following map of Aotearoa pinpoints the location where Salome was seen visiting islands located near the main ports, which were formerly used to quarantine people and animals with contagious diseases. I will now speak briefly about each photograph in the chronological order to when the quarantine stations were established. More information can be found in my personal website. Kamautaua Quarantine Island. Ngai Tahu Iwi and Te Ruranga o Otago are acknowledged as the tangata whenua of Kamautaua, meaning a place where nets are set. The island is also referred to as Quarantine Island, as well as St. Martin's Island, and it's located off the Port Chalmers in Otago Harbour. Kamau was Aotearoa's first island quarantine station. In 1863, Scottish settlers traveling in the ship Victory and ill with smallpox and measles were housed on the island. Subsequently, Kamau held people from more than 40 ships. The quarantine station closed down in 1924, and the island is now a recreational reserve and a religious retreat. Otamahua Quail Island. Ngāti Wheke is acknowledged as the tangata whenua of Otamahua, meaning a place where children collected seabird eggs. The island is also known by several names, including Quail, where after Captain Mainsmith saw Koreke native quail in 1842. Sorry, just going back on that. Otamahua was a second island to establish a quarantine station in Ohineho, Littleton Harbour, after Ripapa Island in 1873. In 1925, the leprosy sufferers from Otamahua were transported to the leprosy colony in Matuihe Island in Western Samoa during the New Zealand colonial administration, and subsequently transferred to leprosy colony in Makungai Island in Fiji. Only a few sufferers returned to their homes. Otamahua became a recreational reserve in 1975. Mokopuna Lepa Island, Taranaki whānui ki te Taranui whānui ki te upoko te ika, is acknowledged as the tangata whenua of Mokopuna, meaning grandchild. Between 1903 and 1904, Mokopuna was the home for Kim Lee, a Cantonese grocer supposedly diagnosed with leprosy following a racist complaint from other residents in a quarantine station in Matuihe Island. Kim stayed Island. Kim stayed in Mokopuna for several months, where he was supplied with food and water via flying fox. Lee died alone on Mokopuna on the 14th of March, 1904, and is buried at Matuihe Island. Matuihe Island. The name of Matuihe comes from Te Motuehinga, meaning Ihenga's Island. Matuihe is a crown-owned island and in the Tipaka, Moana, Hauraki Gulf. In 1872, a quarantine station was set up to hold ship passengers with smallpox. In 1874, it quarantined arrivals with scarlet fever. At the beginning of World War I in 1914, which, in addition to other Samoa, captured by New Zealand soldiers. It was a quarantine station again in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. Matuihe became a naval training base from World War II to 1963. Today, Matuihe is a recreational reserve. The Quarantine Island series is completed with the National Biocontainment Laboratory. A critical part of the National Center for Biosecurity and Infectious Diseases in Wallisville, Ngati Tuarangatira Apahat, is now newly completed National Biocontainment Laboratory. This multi-purpose biosecurity response facility provides a world's leading containment laboratory where bacteriologists, virologists, immunologists, and epidemiologists specializing in animal and human health can coordinate scientific work for human and animal diseases, emergencies, and biological threats to Aotearoa. The new laboratory is designed to safely contain dangerous disease organisms such as anthrax, avian flu, polio, and COVID-19. The experience of having been in 4 weeks quarantine myself as a result of traveling between Samoa and Aotearoa in highly restricted environments, maybe reflect on the current global COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on the issue of infection. An infection happens when a foreign virus hijacks a person's body and causes harm. The virus uses that person's body to sustain itself, reproduce, multiply, and colonize. This can kill, damage, or change the cells and make a person sick unless the immune system fights off the infection. The word colonization comes from the word colon, where in the context of biology, the colon contains bacteria that helps the body's absorptions of nutrients from digested material. The process of infection in the body and the subsequent immune response to the infection could perhaps serve as an allegory to the process of colonization. A recent example that resonates with medical diagnosis is how Moana Pacific peoples who migrated to Aotearoa during the 1960s to meet the growing demand for labor shortage during the Industrial Revolution were seen as to infest the privileged mainstream society and required quarantining by police authorities that led to their excision or removal by dawn raids.
New Zealand cities are not such nice places to bring up children anymore.
On 31st of July 2021, Aotearoa witnessed Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern performing a ifonga, a Samoan custom asking for forgiveness towards New Zealand government's actions against Moana Pacific community with the dawn raids. Apulu Rees Autangawaya, a Samoan community leader in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, describes ifonga and quote, "Ifo means to bow down or lower oneself. Ifonga is when the offender covers themselves with a Samoan fine mat as an atonement for their or their kin's wrongdoing. The covering occurs in front of the house of the victim. It is then up to the victim and their family or village whether to accept the ifonga. This can take some time to allow the offender to pause and think about their actions while in darkness, as well as time for the victim and their family to consider the future impacts of their decision, whether to accept it or not. This is a public gesture before the entire village as witness of this act of forgiveness." End of quote. Perhaps there is a resonance between quarantine and ifonga, where Jacinda Ardern being draped over by the Samoan mat could serve as an allegory where the New Zealand government's harmful actions were placed under quarantine to stop their colonial infection against Maori and Moana Pacific peoples. Now that the mat has been lifted, only time will tell whether the ifonga was a genuine action towards decolonization at a time when Maori and Pacific peoples in Aotearoa are at the front line of COVID-19 pandemic and battling low vaccination rates, partly due to the long-held distrust against the New Zealand government's actions in the Moana Pacific that are yet to be resolved. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuki, for such a creative and inspiring presentation and weaving in so many threads in there. Are there any comments, any questions our participants today might have to pose?
I have one, Yuki. Thank you for that presentation. out of all of the islands that you went to, was there one that resonated with you more than the others, or did you have any sort of, I don't know, connection to one more than the other? And if so, why?
I would say that I have a connection to all of them because of the mere fact that how the New Zealand colonial government at the time looked at small islands and how they applied that logic to the islands in the Pacific, as being peripheral, where, you can, move the leprosy problem to the island and they think that that was, a problem solved. But the problem still exists because they went to Samoa and then it went to Makongai, and people died at Makongai and then only a few got back. So it was actually like a surreal experience. One is that, I took Aotearoa for granted being here since 1989, that I've actually never been to these islands before. And I tell you, these islands are beautiful. Oh my gosh, I tell you, they are very beautiful places. But at the same time, they also have a really dark history that actually connects to us in the Pacific, not just through our ancestral, through our shared ancestral lineage with tangata whenua of the places, but at the same time, the colonial perceptions of them. What also struck me about researching these islands is that the pre-colonial histories and the creation stories of these islands by the Maori people is totally stamped out and eliminated. And then I also feel that this, and then I feel like these small islands was like an exercise to the bigger project in the Pacific Islands.
Mm, mm. It's interesting you say that my grandfather, who I never met, he died before I was born, German Tongan, so Gustav Gutenberg, and he was actually detained on Songs Island in Wellington Harbour during World War II because he had a German surname. He himself wrote a letter to the Prime Minister at the time, and it's all documented in the archives, saying, I don't know why you've put me there. Apart from my German name, I am Tongan through and through. And his uncle was also there, and he died and ended up being buried in Waipukaro, around Dannevirke, around that area. So I find I have a connection to the island, even though I don't know him, but it's part of my lineage, my history. But that whole ideology and approach that the New Zealand government at that time had towards Germans, or those who had the German surname, was just so interesting around that they took these men, put them on this island, left them there, and then, they eventually left. But it was just that whole concept of taking them from their little island to an even smaller island, and just to put them away, not to have to deal with them. So I just found that quite interesting in the connection with what you were talking about. So thank you for your presentation. Mahalo.
Thank you, Sandra. Just following on from that, what was really interesting about the detained German colonial officers by the New Zealand soldiers at Matuihe is that, these German colonial officers were essentially like prisoners of war. Mm. So, to our contemporary imagination, prisoners of war, you would think that, they're in a dark cell, they are starved and all those kind of that stuff, right? In a matter of fact, these German colonial officers in Matuihe were treated like guests, diplomatic guests. They had their own farm. They were able to free to play cricket, get on the boat, cross over to the Auckland Harbour, go to the pub and come back and just have a nice holiday, while we in Samoa, were under, brutal, under brutal New Zealand colonial administration. So, that was really hard to fathom. When I went to Matuihe, went through the archives and then saw how they were just living it up. and being treated like, VIP guests. Anyway, let's move on to the other.
Yeah.
But this is interesting because then you mentioned the Mokopuna leper island and the Chinese person. And here we have that connection between racism and quarantine islands and all that other undertone in comparison to Matuihe, where the white race German connection, even if it was a wartime, they were treated so much better. So there's so many dark undertones there.
I also feel like there's also like a hierarchy within the European system, that British citizens were prioritized over Scottish, over, Greek, over French, over all of that, because, Aotearoa at the end of the day was part of the British colony. So all other European countries were kind of like treated like, second class citizens, regardless whether they were infected with leprosy, polio, whatever. If you were British, you were kind of like, in the VIP corner of the hospital. Anyway.
Yeah. There is Daisy, I think, that has put her hand up for a question.
Yes, thank you, Yuki, for your amazing presentation. I'm very interested because being a history major, I find that, it seems like the colonizers had a common practice of removing threat through, ostracism, exiling people, so long as, and it seemed like these small islands became the places where they dumped, the threat. And so I also thought of Molokai, the island in Hawaii, which was popularized through that movie with Father Damien, where people, because they had leprosy, were ostracized. And also, regardless if they had leprosy, also we have in Samoa, which is very common, the practice under colonized the colonial regimes, we had leaders who were considered a threat or threats. And so therefore they were also removed from Samoa and were placed on islands away from Samoa. And so for me, just hearing your presentation has also reminded me of all these other incidents of where, threats, regardless if it was a disease or people, that the easy solution for the colonizers was to remove them so that we can continue to focus on the agenda of, of governing people who were considered childlike, because that was how the New Zealand colonial or colonizers regarded our people, because they had this tendency to take on this paternalistic approach. And therefore, when people started to rise up and speak up, the best solution was take them away so that they don't continue to influence the others. Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Thank you, Yuki.
Yeah, thank you, Yuki. I really enjoyed the presentation. I have a question about the biological allegory, because it's strikingly apt, in terms of the way you've unpacked that. And I wonder, if you extend that allegory, does that make decolonized or people who are allies who have been part of colonization, who can't separate themselves from that colonization because they're direct descendants of it, where do they fit in that biological picture? If Samoa is a body that was colonized and then it's been infected and then it's in a process of healing, it can't amputate that part of the body that had been colonized. There's a healing process. Would you extend the allegory of the biology into looking at decolonization and that process?
I would, because, vaccines actually function in many different ways. So like some vaccines, you actually have to infect in order to generate the immune system to fight back. So if I was to put that, as an allegory to the process of decolonization, I think it's quite problematic to inflict colonization in order for the colonized to regain its independence. So it's a little bit tricky one. But for me, it's not necessarily my position to tell what other allies need to do. What the allies need to do is to understand our struggle, understand our experience, and then find places they feel like they can be most of help and of service, as an ally, but to make sure not take over, because at the end, I feel that true independence and sovereignty has to come from the colonized itself. The colonized has to want it, has to declare it, has to want it. It can't be something that comes from the outside and saying that you should decolonize. So that's why when I think about the United Nations, decolonization committee, telling countries that you should decolonize, does not work. Because if those countries and places and people doesn't want it, then it's not really decolonization. It's actually neo-colonial to tell people they should decolonize.
And one comment is that a lot of Western medicine doesn't treat the illness, but it treats the symptoms of the illness, so that you remove the symptoms and then the person's no longer ill, but the cause of the illness is still there. And that's different to other forms of medicine that are trying to treat the source of the illness, which is, I don't know enough about biology to know the difference between disease and virus and these things, but that's another idea. It's a really amazing allegory. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. I think this was such a rich presentation with so many layers that we could just stay all morning, sort of, unpicking the different elements there. But we need to sort of move on into our morning session. And I will leave it there with just a thought that most of these islands that you presented to us today, Yuki, have become recreational reserves. So how the island's dark history has been flipped around into a whitewashed happy land. And how important is your work to bring to the audience, to this generation, that history of the island?
Part of the process of becoming a recreational reserve is also something that's led by the local iwi. To help rejuvenate the nature of the place. I mean, a lot of, not all the thing about all of these islands is that not only they have become, recreational, but they also have become natural reserves, to repopulate the island to how it used to be, in pre-colonial times. So, they fenced areas, they introduced indigenous species, plants that are endemic to those islands, try to, to revive the ecology of it. Yeah, but, I think there's more layers to it than being just recreation. But at the same time, I also feel like, it's also kind of like New Zealand tourism branding, using, with Teresia today, we're talking about militarism and how, in Hawaii, the US government pumps in a lot of money into tourism to disguise all of this, military activities. And then I kind of feel like, in a way, New Zealand tourism marketing kind of does that in a way. And then, but what's really amazing about Otamahua, Quail Island, is that they've actually preserved the leprosy colony and turned it into a museum. So people actually can go there and understand what took place. But I mean, I was just walking in and out, but most of the people, they're afraid to go in there. Because, outside there's a placard that says that, quarantine station for leprosy, and they like just refuse to go inside. And as they see me and my crew walking in and out of the museum, they all think that we're weird. But I think that there's certainly still like a fear revolving around these islands, like in the local context. So as much as what government, tried to push the nature angle, you know, in rebranding these islands. It's a different kind of experience, you know, when I speak to the skipper, you know, of the local area who I have to hire to go there, because, you know, I can't catch ferries because, you know, they all go at certain times, and, you know, I had to be on location, you know, to see a certain areas of the island that the public ferries don't go to. So, you know, when you hire the local skipper, you know, that's where all the stories come out, you know. Yeah, so it's quite amazing. It was a very amazing experience. It was really enriching because I actually learned a lot. But the Quarantine Island series is not about Aotearoa. It's actually about Samoa. So I'm learning more about Samoa by learning about these quarantine islands.
Yeah. There is so many layers there. I could happily stay with you for the rest of the morning, I think, Yuki. But I hope that we can continue these conversations at another time. And thank you very much for your time. We will now move into our morning session.